Hello, this is Tony DeMaria, the editor of JACC, and I'm here talking to Dr. Peng Chen. And Dr. Chen is the Division Chief of Cardiology at the University of Indiana and a well-known electrophysiologist. And in a recent issue of JACC, we have studied in some depth the Brugada Syndrome, often written about but not often seen. So, Peng, can you tell us, again, review for us exactly what are the features of the Brugada Syndrome?
Yeah, Tony, thank you for inviting me. Brugada Syndrome was first published in 1992 in your journal, in JACC. And in that original report, there are 8 patients. All of them have ventricular fibrillation, sudden death, syncope, and serious arrhythmia. But the most dramatic feature is that there is ST segment elevation in these V1 to V2 or V3. And looks like a right bundle branch block pattern. But those elevations are very peculiar. It's not associated with ischemia. And the authors, which are Brugada and Brugada, were able to link that ECG pattern with the lethal arrhythmia, and therefore it is called Brugada Syndrome.
Yeah. Now, Brugada Syndrome has provided some interesting insights into the channelopathies, hasn't it?
Yes. Brugada Syndrome is known to be associated with the mutation of alpha subunit of the sodium channel, or SCM5A. But that accounts only for about 20 to 25% of the people with Brugada syndrome. There are other mutations associated with Brugada syndrome, and the majority of patients with Brugada syndrome does not have a known mutation. So that's still an ongoing story about what is causing the Brugada syndrome.
So the assumption is that they have some mutation, we just haven't found it yet. Is that correct?
Correct. In some patients, they have found it to be sodium channel gene, but in many patients, they have not found it. So the problem, of course, is exactly what is the nature of the genetic mutation. That is unclear.
Now, how do we pick up, how do we get sensitized to identifying these Brugada patients? Do they always have the obvious ECG abnormality?
No, many patients with Brugada syndrome would present without an obvious ECG abnormality. So that is a challenge of diagnosis. The Brugada syndrome are diagnosed in one of the 2 ways. One way is the patient would present with a resuscitated young person resuscitated from sudden cardiac death. And then the ECG showed the typical patterns without QT prolongation, but ST elevation, lead V1 to V3, and look like right bundle branch block. The other kind of patients, the patients are completely asymptomatic. I just showed up in your office, and the first ECG showed this abnormal pattern, and you're scratching your heads and see, what am I going to do with it?
Yeah, well, tell me, Peng, the 3 articles that comprise the mini focus on Brugada that you've reviewed and editorialized, what new insights did they bring to Brugada?
Very interestingly, one of the paper discussed about the Brugada syndrome and atrial fibrillation. Back in the 1992, in the original report, one of the 8 patients did have atrial fibrillation. So the subsequent reports about atrial fibrillation instance about 10 to 15%. This paper has a large series of patients, and they studied atrial fibrillation, confirmed the instance to be about 10 to 15%, and they made an association between the spontaneous atrial fibrillation and the ventricular fibrillation. They found that atrial fibrillation also tends to be occurring at night, and just like VF is paroxysmal, it comes and goes. There are more patients with genetic mutations of the sodium channel, but on the other hand, there are also patients without it and still have atrial fibrillation, ventricular fibrillation. So the key is there is an association between atrial fibrillation and ventricular fibrillation.
More common than we thought. And in our closing seconds, the other papers?
The second paper is on the action potential duration on the epicardium, where the author invented a way to record from the conus branch of the right coronary artery. And the third paper is about the restitution characteristics of the patients with Brugada syndrome, and the patient with steeper action potential duration restitution, that is the change of action potential related to preceding diastolic interval. Those patients with more change tends to have more induced ventricular fibrillation.
Yeah, so that may provide a mechanism to predict the patients likely to have events.
Yes, exactly. I think that is a good analogy. And Yes.
Yeah, well, some interesting new data linking Brugada to
Absolutely.
AFib and to impaired restitution. And again, more information about a very interesting, if infrequently seen disease. Thanks a million, Peng.
Thank you, Tony, for inviting me.